I greet you and welcome you to the lesson. The subject is corporate governance and ethics. Today we are starting on a new topic known as governance of risk. This topic has 7 subtopics, namely 1. Strategic risk and the board. 2. Risk appetite framework. 3. Different types of risks. 4. Board oversight functions. 5. Internal control framework. 6. Compliance risk. 7. Best practices for overseeing risk assurance and reporting. In our today's lesson, we will study the first sub-chapter, which is strategic risk and the board. Strategic risk and the board. Strategic risk and the board. That is the first subtopic, strategic risk and the board. Now, these two candidates, strategic risk and the board, are intrinsically linked with corporate governance. And strategic risk refers to the potential for adverse outcomes or negative impacts on a company's ability to achieve its long-term objectives due to errors in strategic decision making or due to errors the external environment that could undermine its competitive position. That's the meaning of strategic risk. Strategic risk. Strategic risk. I say it is the potential for adverse outcomes. It is the potential for adverse outcomes. It is the potential, strategic risk is the potential for adverse outcomes on a company's ability to achieve its long-term objectives. It is the potential for adverse outcomes on the ability of the company to achieve its long-term objectives. Because of the word strategic, we have to bring in the aspect of long-term objectives. Generally speaking, risk is the potential for adverse outcomes. That is risk. But here we are referring to strategic risk, which is the potential for adverse outcomes on the ability of the company to achieve its long-term objectives. And this inability, the potential for inability to achieve long-term objectives, may be occasioned by errors in strategic decision making or errors from the external factors that could undermine its competitive position. And the board of directors play a crucial role in identifying, assessing, and mitigating these risks. Do you understand? So what is the board's role in strategic risk governance? Board's role in strategic risk governance. Board's role in strategic risk governance. That is the question we ought to answer. What is the role of the board in strategic risk governance? The first role is to set risk appetite. Number one, setting risk appetite. It is the role of the board to set the risk appetite of the company. The board determines the level of risk the company is willing to accept in pursuit of its strategic objectives, and that involves considering the potential rewards, considering the potential drawbacks of different strategies, and ensuring that the company risk taking aligns with the overall risk appetite. So the first role of the board in strategic risk governance is to set risk appetite. The second role is to identify strategic risks. Identifying strategic risks. It is the role of the board to identify strategic risks. The board works with management to not only identify but also to assess potential risks that could disrupt the company's strategy, such as changes in the market, such as disruptive technologies, such as regulatory shifts, and reputational damage. Those are some of the risks that can affect the company's um, ability to achieve its long-term objectives. Identifying strategic risks. Number three, it's the role of the board to evaluate risk mitigation strategies. It is the role of the board to evaluate risk mitigation strategies. The board evaluates the effectiveness of risk mitigation strategies proposed by management, and that involves considering the costs and benefits of different approaches and then ensuring that adequate controls are in place to manage the identified risks. That is the third role. Role number four, overseeing risk management. It is the role of the board to oversee the management of risk. The board oversees the implementation of risk management strategies and then monitors the company's risk profile on ongoing basis. And that includes reviewing risk reports, challenging management assumptions, and ensuring that risk management is integrated into the company's overall decision-making process. Overseeing risk management is a role that board members must play. Five, communicating with stakeholders. Communicating with stakeholders. Now, the board communicates with shareholders and other stakeholders about the company's strategic risks and how they are being managed. And that fosters transparency and also builds trust with the stakeholders. So these are five roles that the board plays in regard to strategic risk governance. Now, let us proceed and identify some of the challenges in strategic risk governance. Challenges in strategic risk governance. Now, the first challenge is complexity. Complexity is a challenge in strategic risk governance because candidate strategic risk can be complex, strategic risks can be interconnected, making them challenging to even predict and to assess. So that's one of the main challenges of strategic risk governance? Complexity. Number two, uncertainty. Uncertainty. The future we know is inherently uncertain, making it challenging to predict the likelihood and the impact of potential risks. Uncertainty. You understand? Three, bias. Bias. Board members may have biases that influence their perception and the assessment of risk, and that is a challenge in strategic risk governance. Four, short-termism. 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 Now, boards may focus on short-term results at the expense of long-term risk management, and that is a challenge. That can be a challenge. So these are four challenges in strategic risk governance. So let's now look at some of the best practices. The best practices, I'll have the best practices on page 3. Best practices. Best practices in strategic risk governance. Best practices. Now, the first best practice is to establish robust risk framework. Establish robust risk framework. One, establish robust risk framework. One best practice in strategic risk governance is to establish a robust risk framework. To develop a comprehensive risk management framework that includes processes for identifying, assessing, and mitigating, and also monitoring strategic risks. The second best practice is to foster a risk-aware culture. Foster a risk-aware culture. The board should foster a risk-aware culture. Foster a risk-aware culture. That means encouraging a culture where risk is considered in all the decision-making processes. All right? All the decision-making processes. Do you understand? 3, enhance board expertise. That is a best practice, enhancing board expertise. Ensure that the board has the necessary skills and experience to understand and evaluate strategic risks. 4, seek external expertise. Seek external expertise. In other words, consult from external experts who can help identify and assess strategic risks. Then lastly, regularly review. Regularly review and update. Reviewing and updating. Review and update the company's risk profile and risk mitigation strategies on an ongoing basis regularly. So these are best practices in um, strategic risk governance. You understand? Now, here in Kenya, the Capital Markets Authority Code of Corporate Governance for public listed companies emphasizes the importance of effective risk management and the board's role in overseeing the process. And by adhering to principles of good corporate governance and adopting best practices in strategic risk government or strategic risk management, companies can enhance their resilience and long-term sustainability. So that's all for today's lesson, where we've studied strategic risk and the board, the role of the board in strategic risk governance. We began by defining what strategic risks are. We say that it is the potential for adverse outcomes on the ability of the company to achieve its long-term objectives. Then we have outlined the role of the board in strategic risk governance. Four roles. One, setting risk appetite. Two, identifying strategic risks. Three, evaluating risk mitigation strategies. Four, overseeing risk management. And lastly, communicating with stakeholders. Then we have identified four challenges in strategic risk governance. One, complexity. Two, uncertainty. Three, bias. And lastly, short-termism. We've gone further to highlight some of the best practices in strategic risk governance. One is establishing robust risk framework. Two, fostering risk-aware culture. Three, enhancing board expertise. Four, seeking external expertise. And lastly, regularly reviewing and updating the company's risk profile and mitigation strategies on an ongoing basis. Here is your today's assignment. One, how does the board integrate risk management into the overall business strategy? Two, what processes could be put in place for the board to identify and assess strategic risks? Three, how frequently does the board review? How frequently should the board review and update the strategic risk landscape? Four, what role does the board play in ensuring the organization's resilience to strategic risks? Five, how does the board ensure that strategic risks are communicated effectively across the organization? Thank you. Bye.